On this day, the 26th of October, 1905, King Oscar II of Sweden-Norway recognizes the dissolution of the personal union between Norway and Sweden. He renounces all claims to the throne of Norway, leading to a new monarchy being established in an independent Norway. When you think of Norway and Sweden, or when I think of Norway and Sweden, I think of two very peaceful, well-off countries, right next to each other, very peaceful, no cause for alarm, there's not going to be any war between them. In 1905, that wasn't certain. Norway had been in a personal union with Sweden for almost 100 years at this point. In 1814, Sweden had used the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars to seize Norway from Denmark. At this point, Sweden, under Bernadotte, the first Bernadotte king of Sweden, he was an ally of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburgs. Before that, Bernadotte had been one of Napoleon's marshals, and when offered the crown of Sweden, had told Napoleon, if there's a conflict between Sweden and France, then I will be on the side of Sweden. Although he hoped that Sweden and France would maintain their alliance. Obviously that didn't happen. And at the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, Bernadotte fought against Napoleon and helped defeat him, ensuring his maintaining the throne of Sweden, which his ancestors to this day do. So, having taken Norway from Denmark, which had been a French ally, and no one really cared because we're not going to take something away from an ally and give it to an enemy, Norway was now part of a union with Sweden. And this continued almost for 100 years. 1905 was a very special year in Norway because this was when they decided to break with Sweden. Norway had much more in common with Britain at the time. Sweden was much friendlier with Germany. And there are implications that Britain encouraged Norwegian separatism. We don't know if this directly is true, but there are some suspicions. They didn't want Germany being in control of the Atlantic ports of Norway in any event of a war between Britain and Germany, especially if Sweden was going to be an ally of Germany. Norway also was fiercely independent. They had wanted to be independent back in 1814 and tried when the Swedes had invaded, but the Swedes put paid to that. Now, things were more favourable to them. They had a referendum, which is quite an interesting referendum, and it's one of the most interesting ones because it was 99.5% for separation and 0.5% against separation. Now, that means that less than 200 people voted to remain part of Sweden. Probably one of the most lopsided election results or referendum results in all of history. This was obviously the will of the Norwegian people. They wanted to be independent, every single one of them basically. And at the time, it was only men who voted, so talking about 300,000 men who voted. There was also some feminists who went out and they got petitions from women demanding independence, and about a similar number signed that, so about another 300,000. So at the time, about 1 million people in Norway, pretty much everyone was for independence. The Norwegian Parliament, they had a parliament already, and they had a government. They were willing to fight. And for a moment, it looked as if that might have to happen. The Swedish king and the Swedish government were not happy with this. They didn't want to accept it. And it was a bit dodgy for a while. The Swedish opposition in Parliament, Social Democrats, were against any war. They wanted a peaceful separation. But the Norwegians were willing, if necessary, to go to war. Thankfully that didn't happen, because that would have been a bit of a sore point, having a war back then. You know how these wars and separatist wars, they tend to linger in the minds. And so, on this day, King Oscar renounced his claim to the Norwegian throne and recognized that Norway was now a separate kingdom. How they went about creating their own kingdom is interesting as well. There were some people in Parliament and in the government who wanted to have a republic, but most people they didn't want to upset other European powers. At the time, except for France, Switzerland and San Marino, every country in Europe was a monarchy of some sort, constitutional or autocratic. So they didn't want their separation from Sweden to be seen as anything radical or dangerous. So most people, even people who leant towards being Republican, decided to look for a king. And they found the guy that they liked, one of the princes of Denmark, the younger prince, not the crown prince, the second son, who was married to Princess Maud of Britain. So she was Edward VII's youngest daughter. So they thought, well, that's good because as a British princess, we want to cozy up to the Brits. And this Danish guy has blood that goes back to the old Norwegian royal family. So they asked him, and he asked his dad, and they gave their permission. And this guy also had blood relations with the Bernadottes of Sweden as well, so they were covering all their bases. In the subsequent referendum, 75% of Norwegians voted for the establishment of monarchy. And that was an overwhelming number, and then they also voted for this guy to become king. So, probably one of the very few kings to be elected into office. And he was also then elected by the Norwegian Storting, or Parliament. And he insisted on this because he wanted to make sure that there was going to be no question around his legitimacy or that of his family. So, on this day, Norway becomes independent, the 26th of October, 1905. If you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Like, subscribe, and comment.